They called me worthless, not knowing I was the one who built the very company my sister would be interviewing with the next morning. Sometimes, the people closest to you are the ones who understand you the least. Have you ever sat in the middle of your own family and felt like you didn't belong at all? They look at you with quiet pity, wrap you in old labels that no longer fit, and not once do they stop to ask, who have you actually become? I stayed silent for years, not because I was weak, but because I decided to let my work speak louder than my words ever could. And then one day, my sister, the one they've always adored, walked into an interview room completely unaware that the person sitting across from her was me. That was the day everything they believed about me collapsed. And if you've ever been dismissed simply because you chose a different path, then this story is yours too. The backyard smelled like ribs and smoke and memory. The folding tables were set the same way they'd always been. Plastic tablecloths, paper plates, and that one old chair everyone knew better than to sit in. Laughter spilled out from the patio, bouncing off brick and breeze. Kids screamed through the sprinklers soaked in sunlit. Uncles argued near the beer cooler voices, loud with nothing that mattered. And me, I stood by the side fence holding a warm lemonade I didn't remember pouring. I was 32, but still cast in the same old family role, the uncertain art major who never figured it out. That girl. The one they stopped asking about somewhere around 2015. Sabrina showed up like always, perfectly timed, perfectly dressed, perfectly composed. Her pale blue jumpsuit clung in all the flattering ways. She looked like a woman who had never second-guessed a thing in her life. And just like that, all conversation bent toward her. She just finished her dual degrees, Mom announced, her voice rising with pride. Wharton and MIT. I could hear the applause in her tone. Back-to-back interviews with Fortune 500 companies. She added, eyes drifting toward me without really looking. That girl is going places. The silence that followed was heavier than anything anyone said. Then came the smile, that practiced pause. Meanwhile, she continued, some of us still haven't quite figured out what they want to do. Isn't that right, Evelyn? I didn't answer. I didn't even blink. Dad chuckled from behind the grill, flipping steaks like he had something wise to say. Still playing with that little online thing he asked. What was it again? Workflow. Consulting. He laughed light and dismissive like I was 12 again, and had just told him I wanted to be a magician. I just nodded and sipped my drink. No one here needed to know about the board meeting I had at 9 a.m., or that I'd be signing off on the acquisition of a $45 million firm, or that Cascade Logic was mine. Because here, none of that mattered. Here I was still the question mark, still the afterthought. If you've ever stood in a room full of people who know your name, but not your story, tell me in the comments. I'd love to hear yours. Because if you think this moment was awkward, just wait. Sabrina clapped her hands together, the performative kind of gesture that demanded silence before an announcement. Guess what she said already, grinning like she'd won something. I have a big interview tomorrow. The patio hushed just enough for her voice to carry. With Cascade Logic, there was a beat. Then the reaction surged. Cheers, laughter, the clinking of glasses. Aunt Linda rushed in first with her rosé already sloshing from the cup. Oh, sweetheart, that's incredible, she said. That company is everywhere right now. I read about the founder, she added, eyes wide. Brilliant woman, built the whole thing herself. Deborah's eyes lit up as if someone had just handed her a trophy. That's the one with the woman CEO, right? Totally self-made. I didn't speak, I didn't smile, I just watched. Sabrina nodded chest high. They reached out to me, she said. I didn't even apply. They said my profile stood out. More cheers, more praise. The attention felt so loud it almost echoed. Thomas raised his beer in salute. They've got high standards, I hear. They don't just take anyone. No, they don't. I looked down at my cup, pretending to be interested in the condensation collecting along the sides. But in my mind, I could see the HR email from earlier that week. Subject line, final candidates for strategy consultant. There she was, Sabrina Collins, neatly listed right under 2 Ivy League grads with better references. Her resume was pretty, polished, well-structured, but thin, propped up by names she'd borrowed, not built. Still, she had no idea. No idea that the company she was celebrating was mine. No idea that the woman she was quoting from Forbes was sitting 8 feet away. No idea that the person leading the interviews tomorrow would be me. And I wasn't going to tell her. Because this wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about pride. It was about stillness. About letting people talk just long enough to hang themselves with their own assumptions. Sabrina flipped her hair and beamed. It's for a senior strategy consultant role. They think I could be executive material. I nodded slowly. That's exciting. Good luck. She laughed lightly the way people do when they're sure they don't need it. The conversation drifted like smoke curling away from the grill. But her voice still rang in my ears, the way it always had, bright, confident, heavy with certainty. I watched her cross the yard, soaking in every compliment, every affirmation like it was her birthright. If only she knew. If you've ever had someone brag to your face about something you built with your own hands, tell me in the comments. There's a strange ache in staying silent, but there's power in it too. And soon she was going to feel every inch of that silence, because she wasn't just walking into any interview tomorrow. She was walking into mine. So I asked casually, swirling the ice in my cup, what role are you interviewing for? Sabrina turned to me like a pageant queen being handed a microphone. Senior strategy consultant, she said, slow and proud, like it tasted good on her tongue. They said it's practically executive level. I nodded with interest. Impressive. She smiled at me then, the kind of smile people reserve for tired cashiers or strangers who look a little lost. Don't worry, she added, leaning in just slightly. Voice sweet and syrupy. If I get hired, I'll put in a good word for you. There it was. That tilt of her head. That condescending kindness she'd perfected since high school. Like she was offering me a life raft while I floated on still water. I mean, she continued, I'm sure Cascade Logic has a few entry-level admin positions. Something steady. Maybe even remote if that's more your pace. I opened my mouth and closed it again. Because what do you say to someone who's built their identity on the assumption that you've failed? Who sees their ambition as charity and your silence as proof? Deborah, who had drifted back over just in time, nodded in agreement. That's very thoughtful, darling. Your sister could use the help. 32 and still... She trailed off her hand, waving vaguely in my direction like I was a misplaced object in her peripheral vision. I sipped my drink to avoid speaking. Because if I had spoken, I would have told them about the view from my office, the 27th floor-to-ceiling windows looking over Camelback Mountain. I would have told them about the private lounge, where I hosted executives twice their age, about the team of analysts I led into one of the most competitive AI markets in the country. I would have told them about the Forbes feature last month, the silent success, how they called me one of the most influential women in tech, how they quoted my leadership style, how they admired that I'd chosen to remain anonymous under the name E.R. Collins, with only a silhouette photo to protect my privacy. But I didn't, because this wasn't the moment for truth. It was the moment before the unraveling, the breath before the fall. I looked at Sabrina, still basking in the attention, like it was sunlight, and she'd earned every ray. And I thought how easy it must be to live in a world where you are always the success story, even when you haven't built a thing for yourself. I could feel the heat rise behind my cheekbones, not from shame, from restraint, because in that moment, everything in me wanted to say, you're applying to work for me, and you don't even know it. But I swallowed it, like I had so many times before. Because timing is everything. If you've ever had to hold your truth in your mouth while people spoke over you with their small, easy assumptions, leave a comment. I know how that tastes, metallic, heavy, but sometimes it's better to let silence grow until the truth is too big to ignore. And that moment was coming. It wasn't here yet, but it was already breathing down her neck. By the time the paper plates had started to curl and the citronella candles had burned halfway down, I knew it was time to leave. I gathered my things without much fuss. No one asked why I was heading out early. No one offered to walk me to the driveway. That part was familiar. I climbed into my old SUV, the one I kept just for events like this. The paint had faded near the trunk, and the seat creaked a little when I leaned back. My real car, the white Mercedes, was parked downtown in the underground garage, untouched, out of view, exactly how I liked it. I started the engine and checked the rearview mirror. The patio lights glowed warm behind me, casting everyone in soft gold. I could still hear them laughing, still hear her. Tomorrow changes everything, Sabrina shouted just loud enough to carry across the yard. I paused with my hand on the gear shift. She wasn't wrong. Tomorrow would change everything, just not in the way she imagined. I smiled to myself, quiet calm, with the kind of certainty that doesn't need an audience. Then I backed out slowly, careful not to run over the sidewalk chalk the kids had drawn earlier. I didn't feel the need to correct her. That was the old version of me, the one who wanted to be understood, to be seen, to be heard. But I'd learned something over the years. Silence holds more weight than 1,000 explanations, especially when the truth is about to walk through the door on its own. If you've ever left a gathering knowing you were the one holding the real story, I'd love to hear it in the comments. Some truths don't need to be shouted, they just need to arrive at the right time. And that time was less than 13 hours away. By 6:30 a.m., I was already in my office. The building was quiet, just the low hum of servers waking up and the faint sound of the cleaning crew finishing up downstairs. My heels clicked softly against the polished floor as I moved through the glass hallway, my reflection looking sharper than I felt. I wore my slate gray Alexander McQueen suit, not for style, for armor. Some women put on perfume or earrings before a big day. I buttoned every inch of fabric like I was suiting up for war, not against Sabrina, not even against Deborah or Thomas, but against the part of me that still wondered if I was enough without their approval. I poured myself coffee, black, no sugar, and opened the agenda for the day. Final round interviews. 5 candidates. One of them, my sister. Tasha knocked lightly and stepped in, a manila folder in hand. "She's here," she said with a small smile. 25 minutes early. I arched an eyebrow. Punctual, that's new. Tasha nodded. She also posted about it. Her caption says, "Manifesting greatness, future exec at Cascade Logic." Marketing already flagged it. I let out a quiet breath somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. Has she now? I took the folder and opened it. There it was, Sabrina Collins. Her resume laid out in clean fonts and confident spacing. 2 elite degrees, leadership training, internships with big-name firms, awards from places that sounded impressive if you didn't know how they worked. On the surface, it was perfect, but I knew better. Last quarter, we passed $128 million in revenue. None of that came from pity or golf course connections. It came from grit code and 10 years of sleepless nights. I'd seen the phone calls behind those internships, the favors pulled from Dad's golf buddies, the glowing references drafted by our uncle's firm. I remembered the night she called crying over group projects she didn't finish, how someone always covered for her in the end. This wasn't a resume. It was a performance, a polished presentation of potential that had never been tested under real fire. Tasha lingered a second longer. "The board's wondering why you're sitting in on this one," she said, not unkindly. "Quality control," I replied, closing the folder. "How many interviews before mine?" 3, she said, all briefed. They'll ask the right questions. I nodded, rising from my chair and smoothing the lines of my suit. I didn't need to say more. If you've ever looked at a piece of paper and seen through it, really seen through it, you know what I felt in that moment. Not anger, not pride, just clarity. She was ready to play the part. But I wasn't looking for actresses. I stood behind the one-way glass on the upper floor and watched her walk into the interview suite. Head held high, Chanel blazer, Prada heels, confidence like smoke visible but not solid. She shook hands like she owned the room. She had no idea. This wasn't personal, this was protocol. If you've ever stood behind the glass watching someone step into a space they think they understand, drop a comment. It's a strange kind of power, but not the kind you gloat over. It's the kind that reminds you the truth doesn't have to shout. And in less than an hour, mine would finally speak. Sabrina had made it through the first 2 interviews. I watched from behind, the one-way glass arms crossed, silent. She walked in like she owned the building. And maybe in her mind she did. Each answer came polished, well-practiced. Her voice rang with just the right amount of enthusiasm. Her resume did most of the talking, but with every question, I could see the mask slip. Slightly. Just enough. The first interviewer pressed her on team management experience. Her answer leaned on buzzwords, not real outcomes. The second asked about conflict resolution. Sabrina smiled too quickly, glossed over a vague group project from grad school. By the time she entered the final interview mine, her shoulders had tightened. Her voice had lost a shade of certainty. Tasha opened the door and ushered her in. She's ready for you. I sat with my back to the windows facing the far wall of my office chair, turned slightly away. It was intentional. Please have a seat, I said, not turning around. I heard the chair glide as she sat. Thank you for meeting with me, Mr. Lin. I know your time is valuable. I paused, then turned my chair slowly, deliberately. It's Miss Lin. I let the silence sit there. I wanted her to feel it. Not the success, but the years of being unseen. I said, Evelyn Renee Collins. The silence hit like a dropped glass. She blinked. Once, twice. Her lips parted, but no sound followed. Her eyes darted around the room over the framed articles on the wall, the plaques, the photo of me shaking hands with a Fortune 100 CEO. Recognition settled in, not all at once, but in pieces. You, she whispered. Yes, I replied, calm. Me. Her face flushed a deep, panicked red. But you're just a freelancer. That's what Mom said. She said. I built this company. I said, voice low, but unwavering. From a studio apartment in Tempe, while you and Mom laughed about my little business thing. She was shaking her head as if that might undo it, as if denial might rewrite the room. Every time you flashed your degrees, I was signing international contracts. I continued. While Dad called me a phase, I was landing clients you only read about in case studies. You lied. No, I said. You never asked. I opened the banking app on my phone and turned it so she could see. One transaction, a 6-figure transfer. That birthday money Mom mentioned, I said. That was my share. For me, that number's just a rounding error. Her eyes filled, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were anger, humiliation. The kind that comes from having a mirror held up too close. So now what, she asked, voice sharp. You're going to tell them humiliate me in front of everyone. I leaned back. I don't have to say a word, I said. Your interview said enough. I opened her evaluation file and read the comments aloud, not to shame, but to state the facts. 3 senior partners, I said. All said the same things. Arrogant, underprepared, surface level, entitled. She stood abruptly. The poise she wore like perfume had vanished. Her heels wobbled slightly. Her designer blazer looked smaller now, less structured, like a costume unraveling. You set me up. No, I said. I gave you exactly what you asked for, an interview with the CEO. She stared at me wide-eyed, breathing hard. You're not ready, I said simply. And this company doesn't hand out roles to people who aren't. If you've ever had to say no to someone who never thought they'd need your, yes, I'd love to hear how that felt. There's a quiet kind of courage in holding your line. Sabrina didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. But I knew there'd be fallout, and it wouldn't take long. Sabrina didn't slam the door when she left. She didn't yell. She didn't demand answers. She just stood there for a moment, her fingers twitching at her side like they were grasping for something invisible. And then she walked out, heels, unsteady shoulders, no longer squared eyes, fixed on the floor like it might offer a way out. I waited until I heard the elevator chime, then pressed the intercom. Tasha, I said calmly, please cancel my dinner plans with the family. Yes, ma'am, she replied, no questions asked. I stood up, smoothed the lines of my suit, and walked toward the boardroom. Our quarterly meeting was set to begin in 12 minutes. Mergers to finalize, projections to adjust, real work. As I walked down the hall, I caught my own reflection in the dark glass sharp silence certain. There was no gloating in me, no thrill, just relief. Not because I had won, but because I no longer needed to play small for their comfort. Because I had told the truth just by sitting still, just by being exactly who I was, where I was. Sabrina hadn't expected to leave that room with less than what she came in with. But sometimes silence strips everything bare. If you've ever held your tongue not because you were weak, but because you were done explaining yourself, drop a line in the comments. That kind of quiet is not emptiness. It's earned, and it changes things more than shouting ever could. What happened next? Well, the society Lintz didn't stay silent for long. It didn't take long. Less than an hour after the final interview ended, my phone began buzzing on my desk. One message after another, rapid and heavy like rain on a windshield. First came the one from my mother. Deborah Collins, I can't believe how cruel you were today. Sabrina is devastated. She looked up to you. You've crushed her. Then my father, Thomas Collins. What you did was heartless. You embarrassed your sister. Family doesn't treat each other that way. We raised you better than this. I stared at the screen. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. Raised me better. No. They raised me to smile through disrespect, to nod while they praised Sabrina and questioned me, to dim my light so hers could shine without competition. They raised me to be small, but I didn't become small. I became something else entirely. I typed slowly, deliberately. Evelyn Collins. You told me to succeed. I did. You told me to work hard, to be independent, to build something real. I did all of that. Just because you couldn't see it doesn't mean it wasn't there. I stared at the blinking cursor, then added one last sentence. You raised me to be strong. I was. And then I turned my phone over, face down. There were more messages after that. Aunt Linda trying to smooth things over. A cousin asking, "Wait, are you really the CEO?" My younger brother sending a string of shocked emojis followed by wow, just wow. I didn't answer any of them, because I didn't need to. I sat back in my chair and looked out the window. Phoenix was already waking up, cars weaving between buildings, sunlight flickering off the glass. There was a board meeting in 20 minutes. Decisions to make, markets to watch, teams to lead. This was my real life. Not the stories they wrote about me around picnic tables. Not the quiet judgment passed between bites of potato salad. Not the assumptions about who I was or wasn't. I was right here, running a company they once called a little project. Signing partnerships they couldn't pronounce. Hiring people who worked for their heroes. And I didn't need anyone's permission to keep going. If you've ever been told to stay humble just so someone else could stay comfortable, tell me below. That kind of manipulation wears a smile, but it stings like shame. I used to think setting boundaries meant I was cold. Now I know it means I'm whole. And as the boardroom doors opened, I stood, adjusted my blazer, and walked in without looking back. Because from here on out, they would have to adjust to me. It didn't happen all at once. The shift was subtle, like the way summer fades into fall. You don't notice it on the first breeze, but one day the sun feels gentler and the shadows stretch longer. That's how the change came. No one said anything directly, not at first. But the little things, they disappeared. There were no more jokes about my online thing. No backhanded comments about working in pajamas. No raised eyebrows when I mentioned a client call. It was as if everyone suddenly forgot the punchlines they'd repeated for years. The Sunday BBQ stopped too. Deborah said she was just too tired to host that week. Then the next, then the next. By the third Sunday, no one asked anymore. The group texts got quieter. Photos of burgers and poolside drinks vanished from our shared album. Birthdays moved to Zoom, but the energy was strained. People smiled too big, laughed a little too loud. Everyone complimented each other's virtual backgrounds, as if that somehow filled the space where comfort used to be. During Sabrina's, no one mentioned her job, not once. She was working now as a project coordinator for a boutique branding agency across town. It was respectable, stable, but it wasn't headline material. It wasn't Wharton and MIT material. And no one knew how to talk about her without the shine. Especially not her. The girl who used to light up the room now just flickered. She still dressed the part, blazers, heels, lips painted bold, but there was hesitation in her voice that hadn't been there before. She showed up late to calls, kept her camera off more often. Once I saw her glance down as I spoke, like the sound of my voice reminded her of something she couldn't undo. Aunt Linda stopped calling to share the latest Sabrina updates. Thomas rarely texted anymore unless it was something short and logistical. Deborah. She sent forwarded articles now. Passive things. 10 ways to reduce stress. Why boundaries are important in adulthood. She never said my name in them, but I knew who they were really for. And me? I didn't push. I didn't correct. I just stayed steady. I kept showing up, kept leading, kept growing. Because I'd learned something. Sometimes after an earthquake, the buildings don't crumble right away. But the foundation shifts, the cracks are there. You feel them every time someone smiles too long or says we're proud like it's a peace offering. They didn't know how to treat me now, not the Evelyn Collins they used to ignore, and not the Evelyn Collins they had to respect. So they did what most people do when they're unsure. They pulled back, and honestly, that was okay. I didn't need their validation. For the first time, I had peace. If you've ever watched people go quiet when they realize they got you all wrong, tell me about it below. That silence, that awkward readjustment. It's not always revenge. Sometimes it's closure. Because what came next was the moment they couldn't rewrite. 3 months later, the silence was broken. Not by a phone call, not by an apology, but by a magazine. Forbes. The cover read, "The Silent Success, How One Woman Built a Billion-Dollar Tech Empire While Everyone Thought She Was Failing." And beneath the headline was my face. No silhouette this time, no initials, just me, full collar, clean lines, a quiet gaze toward the skyline behind my office window. Inside, the article traced everything they never asked about. 10 years of risk grid and nights I couldn't afford sleep. How I worked 2 freelance contracts at a time just to fund my first software prototype. How I taught myself code between shifts and negotiated my first investor meeting while eating dinner off a folding chair. It detailed the sacrifices I made: holidays, missed relationships, strained friendships, lost in the noise of ambition, and the loneliness that came with success nobody believed in. It talked about the isolation, the dinners where I sat quiet while everyone talked over me, the way even my name felt invisible at the family table. And it told the truth about the woman I became anyway. I didn't add a note, didn't send a message. I just had 10 printed copies shipped directly to every home. One for Deborah, one for Thomas, one for Sabrina, and one each for the rest of the extended family, those who once told me I should get a real job. No explanation, just the cover, just the story. I wasn't angry, I wasn't triumphant, I was whole. Because validation that comes too late is just noise, and I wasn't looking for noise anymore. By then, I was already preparing our expansion into Europe. 2 new enterprise partnerships were nearing final terms. Tasha and I had just returned from a scouting trip in Berlin. Cascade Logic was scaling faster than we projected. And I still took the same black coffee. Still wore the same gray suit. Still kept the Mercedes tucked away. Because I hadn't changed. They just hadn't seen me clearly before. If you've ever spent years being misunderstood, underestimated, or flat out dismissed by the people who should have been cheering you on, the loudest "I see you," I lived that silence. And when I finally broke it, it wasn't with shouting, it was with presence. If you've been building something quietly, if you've been planting seeds in the dark while everyone else celebrated the spotlight, know this: your work matters, even if no one claps, even if no one sees it yet. Sometimes success doesn't need to shout. Sometimes it just signs the checks. If this story touched a part of your journey, leave a comment below. Tell me what you're building, what you've overcome, who you've quietly become. Not for revenge, not for recognition, but to remind someone else that they're not alone in the quiet. Let's build this community together, one story at a time. Not for claps, not for noise, but for someone out there who needs to know. The quiet ones are rising.